The evening started just like any other in the upscale neighborhood of Palm Beach. The streets were quiet, lined with towering palm trees and magnificent mansions that glowed softly in the setting sun. Trump's trusted driver of 15 years was making his usual route to pick up his employer from an important business meeting. The driver, a middle-aged man with graying hair at his temples and kind eyes, had made this journey countless times before. He took pride in his work, always ensuring the luxury vehicle was spotless and running perfectly. Tonight, he was driving Trump's personal car, a sleek black vehicle that practically gleamed under the streetlights. As he carefully navigated the winding roads, he noticed a police cruiser following him. At first, he didn't think much of it. He was a professional driver with an impeccable record. He double-checked his speed, made sure his turn signals were working properly, and continued his drive with the same careful attention he always maintained. But then came the flashing lights. Confused but remaining calm, he pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to follow every protocol he'd learned over his decades of professional driving. He placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, turned off the engine, and waited patiently for the officer to approach. Officer Sullivan stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting casually on his belt as he walked toward the luxury vehicle. The way he approached seemed different. There was an air of suspicion that felt unnecessary and uncomfortable. Through the side mirror, the driver could see the officer's stern expression, illuminated by the harsh beam of his flashlight. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. The driver responded politely, explaining that he was Trump's personal driver and had been for many years. But the officer seemed uninterested in this information, instead questioning why someone like him would be driving such an expensive car in this neighborhood. The interaction grew increasingly tense as the officer continued his questioning. Despite the driver's professional demeanor and clear explanations, Officer Sullivan insisted on conducting a full vehicle search. Other patrol cars began arriving at the scene, their lights painting the peaceful street in alternating red and blue. Residents began peering out their windows, drawn by the commotion. The driver remained composed, even as he felt the weight of their stares. He'd spent years building his reputation as a reliable, trustworthy professional, and now he was being treated like a criminal for simply doing his job. What made the situation even more frustrating was that there had been no traffic violation, no suspicious behavior, nothing that would warrant such a response. The driver knew this stop wasn't about his driving or the car's registration. It was about something else entirely, something that shouldn't matter in this day and age. As he sat there, watching Officer Sullivan radio for backup and run unnecessary checks, he made a decision. He would not let this incident go unreported. He would tell Trump about what happened. Not out of revenge or anger, but because he believed that change only comes when people are willing to speak up about injustice. The entire stop lasted 45 minutes. 45 minutes of questioning, searching, and unfounded suspicion. When Officer Sullivan finally let him go, there was no apology, no explanation for the extensive stop. Just a curt nod and a warning to be careful around here. The driver pulled away from the curb with his dignity intact, but his spirit heavy. He was running late now to pick up Trump, but he knew his employer would understand once he explained what had happened. What he didn't know was that this incident would soon spark a chain of events that would shake the local law enforcement community to its core and lead to changes nobody saw coming. As he drove away, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had experienced similar treatment on these same streets, their stories left untold. Little did he know, his decision to speak up about this incident would not only be heard, but would set in motion a series of events that would transform the community's approach to law enforcement and social justice. When Trump's driver finally arrived at the business meeting location, he was visibly shaken. Trump, known for his punctuality, had been waiting outside the building, checking his watch. But the moment he saw his driver's face, his irritation about the delay vanished, replaced by genuine concern. What happened? Trump asked, noticing how his usually composed driver's hands were still trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The driver took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the last hour. As he spoke, describing the unnecessary stop, the questioning, and the obvious profiling, Trump's expression shifted from concern to anger. "How long have you worked for me?" Trump asked, though he knew the answer well. The driver had been with him through countless business deals, campaign rallies, and family events. He wasn't just an employee, he was a trusted member of Trump's inner circle. 15 years, sir, the driver replied quietly. Never had a single traffic violation. Trump pulled out his phone immediately, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he made calls. The first was to his legal team, then to the police department's chief. His voice grew increasingly forceful as he demanded answers about the incident. The police department's initial response was predictable. They tried to downplay the situation. Standard procedure, they called it. Random check, they claimed. But Trump wasn't having any of it. He'd seen the security footage from nearby buildings, showing his driver following every traffic rule perfectly before being pulled over. "I want every detail about this officer," Trump demanded during a heated phone call with the police chief. "Every complaint, every report, everything. This isn't going away." The next morning, news of the incident began spreading through local law enforcement circles. Officer Sullivan arrived at work to find himself under sudden scrutiny. His colleagues watched him with mixed expressions, some sympathetic, others disappointed, and a few clearly uncomfortable with what had happened. Meanwhile, Trump's driver arrived at work to find his employer had already set up meetings with civil rights attorneys and community leaders. Trump made it clear. This wasn't just about one incident or one driver. This was about addressing a systemic issue that had gone unchecked for too long. "You've been loyal to me for 15 years, Trump told his driver during a private conversation in his office. "Now it's my turn to be loyal to you. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The police department's leadership, realizing this situation wouldn't quietly disappear, began their own internal review. They'd pulled Officer Sullivan's records, examining his history of traffic stops. The patterns they found were troubling, but they still hoped to handle everything internally. However, Trump had other plans. He arranged a press conference, giving his driver a platform to share his experience. Local news stations arrived, their cameras ready to capture what would become a pivotal moment in the community's history. The driver, though uncomfortable with the spotlight, knew the importance of speaking up. As he prepared his statement, he thought about his children, his neighbors, and everyone else who had ever experienced similar treatment but didn't have someone powerful in their corner. Community members began reaching out, sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. What started as one incident was quickly revealing itself to be part of a larger pattern that needed addressing. Trump's team gathered evidence, collected testimonies, and built a compelling case that couldn't be ignored. They weren't just fighting for one driver, they were pushing for changes that would affect the entire community. As the day drew to a close, Trump sat in his office, reviewing the security footage for the 100th time. His driver's words echoed in his mind. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Trump made a promise to himself and his driver this wouldn't be just another incident swept under the rug. This time, real change would come, no matter what it took. The press conference was set for 10 a.m. in the grand ballroom of one of Trump's hotels. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the clear blue sky. Inside, journalists checked their equipment while camera operators adjusted their lighting. The air buzzed with anticipation. Trump's driver sat in a quiet room nearby, reviewing his prepared statement. His hands weren't shaking anymore, now they were steady with determination. A week had passed since the incident, and in that time, he'd found strength he didn't know he had. Trump walked in, giving his driver a supportive pat on the shoulder. "Just tell your story," Trump said simply. "That's all you need to do. The truth is powerful enough." The ballroom fell silent as Trump approached the podium. The cameras started rolling, their red lights blinking in unison. Trump began by introducing his driver, speaking about their 15-year working relationship and the trust they'd built. Then he played the security footage on large screens behind him. The video was crystal clear. It showed Trump's car driving perfectly normally, following every traffic rule. Then came the police lights. The unnecessary backup, the lengthy stop. The footage didn't lie. There was no reason for any of it. "This isn't about politics," Trump declared, his voice firm. "This is about right and wrong. This is about making sure every person in our community is treated with respect and dignity." The driver stepped up to the microphone next. His voice was quiet at first, but grew stronger as he shared his story. He talked about his years of service, his clean driving record, and how it felt to be treated like a criminal for no reason. The room hummed on every word. "I'm speaking up not just for myself," the driver said, "but for everyone who's ever been afraid to say something. For every person who's been pulled over and felt that knot in their stomach, wondering if this time would be different." As he spoke, phones around the room lit up with social media notifications. The story was spreading fast. Local residents began sharing their own experiences in the comments. What started as one incident was becoming a movement. Trump's legal team presented their findings next. They'd discovered that Officer Sullivan had a pattern of similar stops, but complaints had been buried in paperwork. They showed statistics, graphs, and testimonies from other community members who'd faced similar treatment. The police department's representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the evidence mounted. They'd hoped to handle this quietly, but now the whole world was watching. The chief of police requested to speak, promising immediate action and a full investigation. But Trump wasn't satisfied with promises. He announced the creation of a community oversight committee that would review police conduct and ensure accountability. He pledged financial support for body cameras and better training programs. This wasn't just about punishing one officer, it was about changing the entire system. Local business leaders in the audience began standing up, pledging their support. Community organizers offered to help implement new training programs. Religious leaders promised to host community dialogue sessions. What began as one man's story was transforming into a citywide commitment to change. After the press conference, Trump's driver found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. People hugged him, thanked him for speaking up, shared their own stories. He realized that his voice had given others the courage to speak too. That evening, as Trump and his driver watched the news coverage together, they saw their story spreading across multiple channels. Phone calls and messages poured in from around the country. Other communities wanted to know how they could implement similar changes. "You did good today," Trump told his driver. "Real good. But this is just the beginning." The driver nodded, knowing tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for the first time since the incident, he felt truly hopeful. Change was coming, and he was proud to be part of making it happen. The internal affairs investigation began early on a Monday morning. Investigators took over a conference room at police headquarters, its walls soon covered with documents, photos, and timelines. What started as a look into one incident quickly grew into something much bigger. Officers brought in box after box of old complaints. Many had been filed away and forgotten, gathering dust in storage rooms. As investigators began sorting through them, a troubling pattern emerged. Officer Sullivan's record showed dozens of similar stops over the years, most involving minority drivers in upscale neighborhoods. "Look at this one," said one investigator, holding up a complaint from 3 years ago. A doctor had been pulled over while driving his luxury car home from a late hospital shift. Another file told the story of a successful business owner stopped while driving his daughter to school. Each story echoed Trump's driver's experience. The investigation team worked late into the nights, reviewing body camera footage, dash cam videos, and patrol records. They interviewed other officers who had worked with Sullivan, and many began opening up about things they'd seen but never reported. One young officer, fresh from the academy, shared how Sullivan had taught him to look for certain types of drivers in wealthy areas. Another admitted to feeling uncomfortable with Sullivan's methods but hadn't known how to speak up. The wall of silence was finally cracking. Trump's legal team arrived daily, reviewing findings and ensuring nothing was overlooked. His driver's case had opened a door, and now years of hidden problems were coming to light. The police chief, realizing the depth of the problem, ordered a review of all traffic stop data from the past 5 years. The numbers were shocking. In wealthy neighborhoods, minority drivers were being pulled over at rates far higher than anyone else. Most stops, like the one involving Trump's driver, had no valid reason recorded. It wasn't just one officer, it was a systemic problem that had gone unchecked for years. Community members continued coming forward with their stories. A retired teacher shared how her son had been stopped 3 times in 1 month while driving her car. A local business owner described changing his route to work to avoid certain police patrol areas. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. Officer Sullivan was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's completion. His fellow officers, seeing the evidence pile up, began distancing themselves. The standard procedure excuse was crumbling as more facts came to light. Trump's driver visited the investigation room one afternoon, looking at the wall of evidence his single act of speaking up had uncovered. He felt a mix of sadness and determination, sad that so many had suffered silently, but determined to see real change happen. The investigation team discovered that several officers had tried to report problems before, but their concerns had been buried in bureaucracy. Good officers who'd wanted to make changes had been discouraged or transferred to other departments. The system had protected itself at the expense of the community it was meant to serve. Local news stations ran daily updates on the investigation's findings. The community watched closely, many feeling vindicated as their long-held concerns were finally validated. Social media buzzed with discussions about police reform and community relations. Trump received regular briefings on the investigation's progress. He shared the findings with other business leaders, encouraging them to support the push for change. This isn't about politics, he reminded them. It's about doing what's right for our community. As the fourth week of the investigation drew to a close, the team prepared their preliminary report. It would detail not just individual incidents, but the larger failures that had allowed these problems to persist. The report would recommend sweeping changes to training, oversight, and accountability. The driver who started it all sat in his car one evening, watching the sun set over the city he'd called home for decades. He thought about all the stories that had come to light, all the people who'd found the courage to speak up. Change was happening, slowly but surely, and it had started with one traffic stop and the decision to stand up and say enough. The local community center buzzed with energy one Saturday morning as hundreds of residents gathered for what would become a historic town hall meeting. People from all walks of life filled the seats: business owners, teachers, doctors, students, and retirees. They were there to share their stories and demand change. Trump's driver sat in the front row, amazed at how his experience had sparked such a massive response. Next to him, Trump listened intently as one community member after another stood up to speak. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight for years. A grandmother stood up, her voice shaking slightly as she described how her grandson, a college student, had started taking longer routes to class to avoid certain police patrol areas. A local shop owner shared how he'd installed extra security cameras not to protect against criminals, but to have evidence if he was stopped while driving home late from work. "This isn't about one incident or one officer anymore," said a respected local pastor, his deep voice filling the room. "This is about building a community where everyone feels safe, where everyone is treated with dignity. We can't go back to pretending these problems don't exist." Trump's legal team had prepared presentation boards showing the investigation's findings so far. The numbers were clear. There was a pattern of unfair treatment that couldn't be explained away. But more powerful than the statistics were the personal stories being shared. Youth groups from local high schools presented their own experiences and ideas for change. They'd created a video compilation of interviews with students and their families, showing how these issues affected the next generation. Their passion and creativity brought tears to many eyes in the room. Local business leaders, inspired by Trump's example, stepped forward with concrete offers of support. One offered to fund new training programs for the police department. Another promised to create internships for young people interested in law enforcement careers. A tech company CEO offered to donate body cameras and data storage systems. The police chief attended the meeting too, sitting quietly and taking notes. He could see that the old way of doing things couldn't continue. The community wasn't just angry. They were organized, united, and ready for real change. Trump's driver, who had been hesitant to speak at first, found himself becoming a natural leader in the movement. People looked to him for guidance, inspired by his courage in speaking up. He shared his story again, but this time focused on the positive changes that could come from this difficult situation. "When I was pulled over that night," he told the crowd, "I felt alone. But look around this room now. None of us is alone anymore. Together, we can make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The meeting lasted for hours, but nobody left early. People exchanged phone numbers, made plans for follow-up actions, and formed committees to work on specific issues. A local civil rights organization offered to provide legal support and guidance for the reform efforts. Trump watched all this with satisfaction. He'd seen the power of community action before, but this was different. This wasn't about politics or publicity. It was about people coming together to solve a problem that affected everyone. As the meeting drew to a close, a group of young children presented drawings they'd made, showing their vision of a community where everyone felt safe and respected. Their innocent artwork, displayed on the community center walls, reminded everyone why this work was so important. The evening news covered the town hall meeting extensively. Reporters interviewed participants, capturing the spirit of unity and determination that filled the room. Social media buzzed with clips from the event, spreading the message far beyond the local community. Trump's driver drove home that evening feeling both exhausted and energized. The weight of his experience was still there, but it felt lighter now, shared by an entire community ready to work for change. As he passed the spot where he'd been pulled over, he realized that place would never be just a bad memory. It would be remembered as the starting point of something important and positive. The police department's training center looked different now. The walls, once bare except for regulations and procedures, displayed new posters about community engagement and cultural awareness. In the main classroom, officers both veteran and rookie sat together, learning from experts about hidden biases and fair policing practices. Trump had personally overseen the selection of training professionals, bringing in respected experts from across the country. His driver occasionally visited these sessions, sharing his story not with anger, but with hope for positive change. The officers listened intently. This wasn't just another required training, this was real life. "We're not here to blame anyone," the driver would say. "We're here to make things better for everyone, both the community and the police officers who protect it." The changes went far beyond just training. A new civilian oversight committee had been established, made up of diverse community members who reviewed police practices and complaints. They met in a newly renovated office space provided by Trump, where citizens could easily access their services. Officer Sullivan's case had finished its review. The evidence was overwhelming, and he chose to resign rather than face a formal hearing. But instead of this creating division, it became a turning point for positive change. The department used it as a case study in what needed to be fixed. The new police chief, selected with community input, implemented a series of reforms. Every patrol car now had updated camera systems that couldn't be turned off during stops. Officers received regular feedback from community members, and good community policing was rewarded in performance reviews. Trump's influence helped secure funding for these changes. He brought together business leaders who saw the value in creating a fairer, safer community. They established a foundation to ensure these programs would continue long-term, not just fade away when media attention moved on. One morning, Trump's driver arrived at a local high school as a guest speaker. The auditorium was packed with students eager to learn about how one person's stand against unfairness had led to real change. He looked out at their young faces and felt hopeful about the future. "Sometimes doing the right thing is scary," he told them. "But when you stand up for what's right, you might find you're not standing alone for long." The students asked thoughtful questions about civic responsibility and creating change. One student shared how his older brother, a rookie police officer, had talked about how much better the new training was. Another mentioned how her parents felt safer driving in the community now. Back at the police department, officers began noticing positive changes in their daily work. Community members were more willing to talk to them, to help with investigations, to see them as partners rather than threats. The us versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared community. The Oversight Committee created a user-friendly website where people could track the progress of reforms, submit feedback, and see real data about police interactions. Transparency built trust, and trust made everyone's job easier. Trump regularly checked in on the progress, not just as a public figure, but as someone who cared about his employees and his community. He attended community meetings, spoke with officers, and made sure the momentum for change didn't slow down. His driver, watching all of this unfold, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The frightening experience that had started everything now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was pride in how the community had come together to create real, lasting change. Late one evening, a young officer pulled over a car for a broken taillight. The driver was nervous, but the officer approached with respect and professionalism, explaining exactly why he'd made the stop and what would happen next. This was the new normal, and it was working. The local news ran a follow-up story about the changes, interviewing officers and community members about the differences they'd seen. The story was picked up by national media, with other cities reaching out to learn from their experience. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The morning sun shone brightly as Trump's driver pulled into the parking lot of the newly established Community Justice Center. The building, once a forgotten municipal office, now bustled with activity. Inside, people worked on programs that had grown from the seeds of that single incident. The driver, now serving as the center's co-director while still working for Trump, walked through the halls, greeting familiar faces. On the walls hung photos documenting their journey: the press conference, the town hall meetings, the training sessions. Each image told part of their story. Today was special. The center was hosting representatives from 12 different cities who had come to learn about their successful police reform program. Trump would be speaking, along with community leaders and police officers who had been part of the transformation. A year ago, I was pulled over for no good reason. The driver began his speech to the packed room. I could have stayed quiet. I could have just accepted it as the way things are. But thanks to Mr. Trump's support and our community's dedication, we chose a different path. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told a powerful story. Complaints about unfair treatment had dropped by 70%. Community trust in law enforcement had risen dramatically. Police officers reported higher job satisfaction. The program had become a model for other cities to follow. Trump stepped up to the podium next, but instead of taking credit, he pointed to the people in the room: community members, officers, activists, and ordinary citizens who had worked together to create change. Real change doesn't come from the top down, Trump said, his voice filled with pride. It comes from people willing to stand up, speak out, and then work together to make things better. My driver taught me that. The local police department had been transformed. The new training programs, now in their third cycle, had created a culture of respect and understanding. Officers and community members regularly met for coffee chats, neighborhood walks, and youth mentoring programs. A group of high school students presented their research project, showing how the changes had affected their daily lives. They interviewed grandparents who spoke about how different things were now compared to their youth. The audience listened intently, seeing the generational impact of their work. The driver's phone buzzed with a message. Another city wanted to learn about their program. The movement they'd started was spreading, creating ripples of change across the country. What began as one man's stand against unfair treatment had grown into something much bigger. Trump had kept his promise to ensure the changes weren't temporary. The foundation he helped establish continued to fund training programs, community initiatives, and youth outreach efforts. More importantly, it funded research to keep improving their methods and sharing what worked with others. After the presentations, everyone gathered in the center's community room. Officers chatted with residents, sharing stories and plans for future programs. The walls between law enforcement and the community had crumbled, replaced by bridges of understanding and respect. The driver noticed a young police officer talking with a teenager about becoming a cop. The officer was explaining how the department had changed, how they now focused on protecting and serving everyone equally. The teenager's eyes shone with interest. This was the future they had worked so hard to create. Trump pulled his driver aside, pointing out how far they'd come. "Remember when you first told me what happened?" he asked. "You were worried nothing would change. Look around now." The driver nodded, watching the room full of people who had become like family. The fear and anger from that traffic stop had transformed into determination, then action, and finally into real, lasting change. As the sun set on another busy day at the center, the driver sat in his car for a moment, reflecting. The spot where he'd been pulled over was now marked with a small plaque, not to remember the injustice, but to celebrate the positive changes that grew from it. He smiled, started the engine, and drove home through streets that felt different now, streets where everyone could feel safe, respected, and heard.